Ready, Cap? All right, we'll meet you back here, okay?
You bet.
A chilling theory about the Avengers Doomsday is circulating. When people started talking about the possibility that the child in Steve Rogers' arms is actually Victor Von Doom, also known as Tony Stark, I literally said no way. We have talked many times about the MCU being a reserved universe. Even if you ignore what we say, the creators already explained this themselves in the Loki series.
Once I isolated our timeline,
all I have to do is manage the flow of time and prevent any further branches. Hence,
The MCU is not an original universe. It is a later modified parallel dimension. However, there is a man who isolates this parallel dimension and destroys all other realities. That man is Kang, who called himself He Who Remains. Preserving the legacy Kang created was left to the TVA and Loki. The MCU constantly needs outside intervention. Otherwise, this universe and all the universes branching from it would be destroyed. Simply put, if you don't water the roots of a tree, it dries up and dies. The MCU is the root of that tree. So, could the baby in Steve's arms really be Stark? After Steve Rogers returned the stones following Endgame, it seems like Loki appeared before him. They will already show this in the movie, so don't worry. Loki will give Steve a mission. He will ask him to give the baby version of Victor Von Doom to the Stark family, and this secret will remain only between them. Kang once built the system this way. Most likely, when he re-reserved the MCU, he guided Victor Von Doom toward a good path in order to benefit from his intelligence. Howard and Maria Stark cannot have a child. Even though it was said in Endgame that they would, that child is never born, my friends. In the comics, Tony Stark was already adopted. As you know, Stark grew up hating Steve Rogers because his father Howard Stark constantly praised Steve at every opportunity. Steve giving the child to them likely plays a big role in this. Steve knows what this child will do in the future. That's why he looks at him with admiration. When he tells Howard that this child is his greatest legacy, Howard may adopt him. In Iron Man 2, Howard believing that his son could solve what he himself could not probably comes from this. This situation causes an infinite paradox that requires constant outside intervention. Stark builds a family, makes friends, gains motivation, and embraces heroism. But deep down, he is still Victor Von Doom. He still believes that true freedom requires limitation. His ideas never change, only his life progresses in a much more perfect way. Stark's greatest contribution here is creating the quantum space-time GPS. All the technologies he developed lay the foundation for the modern technology that will later be used by the TVA. That's why an infinite Tony Stark loop has to exist. This may sound strange to you, but think about this. In the Loki series, Kang placed a variant of himself in the past in case he died. However, he placed this variant so far back that even though he had intelligence, the limitations of the era prevented his development. This character, known as Victor Timely, could have become Kang in the future. But for that to happen, He Who Remains assigned Ravonna and Miss Minutes to guide him. They would give him what he needed and help him take Kang's place again. So the idea of Victor Von Doom being Tony Stark actually seems very simple compared to what we saw in Loki Season 2. Tony Stark was adopted from the very beginning, but the TVA and Loki, who say they can't break this loop, keep taking Victor Von Doom as a baby and giving him to the Stark family over and over again. In the timeline we know, Tony Stark achieved the life he wanted but left before he could fully enjoy it. Therefore, the person we know as Tony Stark was actually Victor Von Doom from the very beginning. Maybe this Victor Von Doom already existed in the MCU, but was taken from his family. As you know, Kang has never been humane about such matters. If Dr. Doom had grown up independently, he might have discovered the TVA in the MCU, killed Kang, and become the one at the top of everything. But by turning him into Tony Stark, they bound his hands. They pushed him toward becoming a hero. That's why they will say Robert Downey Jr. returned to the Marvel Cinematic Universe not as Tony Stark, but as Dr. Doom. Doom will investigate the MCU and realize that this world is fictional. Now you can easily understand why we will see multiple Dr. Doom variants. They will want to end Universe 616 and create a real universe. Because according to Dr. Doom, free will does not exist. In this universe, he did what he was meant to do, and as a result, he died. If he had stepped outside what was intended for him, he would still have been killed and pruned. The only way to create a real universe is to completely destroy the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The TVA is his greatest enemy, because the TVA technically tries to take away the choices of those living in the MCU. I had already shared most of this theory as my own thoughts in previous videos. The only new point for me now is that the baby in Steve Rogers' arms shown in theaters could be Tony Stark. I thought it was Rogers' child, and maybe it really is Steve's child. I'm talking about the theory aspect here. In my opinion, Tony Stark being Victor Von Doom from the beginning has always been the most logical option. In fact, even before the Russo brothers and Robert Downey Jr.'s return was announced, I told you this in my Loki analyses. Tony Stark is the character who guides Kang in this universe, and I said that Kang showed Doctor Strange only one winning outcome out of 14,605,000 possibilities in order to guarantee his own future. If Tony Stark had continued living, he would have further developed quantum technology after Endgame. If you've noticed, after Tony Stark died, no one dealt with time travel anymore. But Stark was a curious man. He would do anything to understand the order and system of the universe. That's why Kang revised a timeline in which Stark dies, so he wouldn't become an obstacle. But the idea that Stark could be Victor Von Doom started being discussed after the Russos and Robert Downey Jr. returned. If we look at this theory from the perspective of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's not nonsense at all, my friends. On the contrary, it's one of the best possible scenarios. As I said, Kang already did this for himself in the Loki series and shaped everyone else's lives, including Stark's, accordingly. In my opinion, this idea now feels much more logical. You know, I always said Steve Rogers would have a child. But wouldn't it be hard to integrate that into the cinematic universe? Peggy would have a child from Steve, and Sharon wouldn't know? Let's say Sharon didn't know. Did Nick Fury not know either? If Steve had a son, in 2023 he should be around 50 or 60 years old. Steve Rogers should have a grandchild by now. So why would he leave the Captain America legacy to Sam Wilson if he had his own grandson? When you look at it from this angle, the baby being Tony Stark, that is, baby Victor Von Doom, makes much more sense than him being Steve's son. Of course, we are talking based on an already existing story. Maybe those involved don't look at it as broadly or think as comprehensively as we do. But in terms of connecting the story, I would prefer Marvel writing an origin for one of its legendary characters rather than giving Steve a son. As I've always said in my videos, Iron Man is not a pure hero. He is an anti-hero who operates in the gray area. The reason Tony Stark is good comes from his defense mechanisms, and his belief that freedom can be sacrificed for protection directly reminds me of Doctor Doom. Here, we're not just talking about the end of the Infinity Saga, but its continuation, because Marvel officially stated that Endgame and Doomsday are directly connected productions. Yet during this process, they practically ignored many of the projects they released. I don't know if you remember, but at one point it was said that Marvel was planning a Disney Plus series. Strong sources like Deadline announced a series that would show how Steve Rogers returned the Infinity Stones. Many other series were also announced, but suddenly they were all canceled. Everyone was surprised because while Disney Plus Marvel content was starting to decline, a series about Steve returning the stones would have drawn a lot of interest. I think the reason might be that they plan to handle this topic in Doomsday, setting the stage for Avengers Doomsday with a storyline where Loki meets Steve Rogers and gives him baby Tony Stark. But if they sold this story on Disney Plus, Doomsday would lose all meaning. That's why we're talking about a story that needs to be told at the beginning of Doomsday. Whether this will resonate with the audience, I don't know. It makes sense to me because I follow everything closely and research the meanings behind what's being told. But will the audience think the same? We'll see together. Because they will have to explain Tony Stark actually being Victor Von Doom without ruining the character. After all, even if Dr. Doom claims he had no free will during his life as Tony Stark, they must not betray what he did in this world or the legacy he left behind. Yes, my friends, I hope you liked the content I prepared. If there are other videos you'd like to see, don't forget to write them in the comments. That's all from me for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.